That's how we roll here at Company. But this is what Lily Goldberg said. She said, I feel waking up in the morning and finding out that my life was all for nothing. We're here for a reason, she said. I believe a bit of the reason is to throw little torches out to lead people through the dark. Now, folks, I'll be the first to admit that Whoopi Goldberg is far from being a theologian. But her comment, I think, illustrates the fact that every human being is driven by this search for significance. We all want our lives to count for something. That's what we've been talking about these past few weeks. For those of you who are visiting with us today, we're actually finishing up a series of sermons that we've entitled Searching for Significance. Over the past few weeks, we've looked at questions like, why am I here? And we discovered that the reason that we're here is because we have been created by God in His image so that we might glorify Him. What we came to understand is until we understand that, then life will always have us searching for more. We then asked the question, what are my priorities? And we concluded that our priorities are God first, our families, our wives, our husbands, our children are second, our jobs, our occupations are third, and then those hobbies or those outside interests, they come last. The problem, we said, is that sometimes we confuse those priorities. And when we do, we find that our meaning in life becomes confused. And we either find ourselves chasing after things that don't bring satisfaction to our lives, or we find at the end of our lives that those things that we thought mattered really don't. But the problem is, by then, it's too late. Last week, E.L. challenged us to look at how we prioritize our life. He said we need to make the most of every opportunity so that when we come to the end of our lives, we won't regret having spent all of our time, all of our energies pursuing things that don't really matter. Well, today we're going to conclude this series by challenging ourselves to discover what our God-given strengths are and how we can use those strengths, those abilities to bring glory to God and to better His kingdom here on earth. And so that when that final day does come, folks, when life comes to an end, we'll be able to hear God say, well done, good and faithful servant. But you see, folks, we believe that ultimate significance, and we said that throughout this sermon series, ultimate significance is found only when we give ourselves to Jesus Christ. Because only Jesus Christ can satisfy that spiritual hunger of the soul. And only Jesus Christ can be, as Whoopi Goldberg said, that torch that leads people out of darkness into the light. It was Jesus Himself who said it this way: whoever will seek to save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake will find it. Now, bearing that thought in mind, let's look together at the book of Romans, chapter 12 this morning, verses 1 through 8. If you have your Bibles with you this morning, or if you've got a smartphone that has a Bible app, why not get it out? Turn to the New Testament book of Romans, Romans chapter 12. In this passage that we're going to look at, what we see is, I think, a proper evaluation of our strengths, of our talents, which are to be used for God's glory. And if we understand and apply just a few simple principles, then I think it will help us to find that significance that we're looking for in our life. And so let's get started this morning, if you don't mind. First principle I think we find in Scripture is for us to remember our priorities. We talked about this for the last several weeks, but Paul writes in verse 1 of Romans chapter 12, he says, therefore I urge you, brothers, in view of God's mercy, to offer your bodies as living sacrifices, holy and pleasing to God. This is your spiritual act of worship. Now, it's funny to me, these words kind of provide a review of the past few sermons. Paul starts off by saying, in view of God's mercy. In other words, God could have disowned us, folks. Even though He created us, even though we disappointed Him, He could have simply disowned us. But as E.L. reminded us when we started this series together, instead God chose us. He adopted us, E.L. taught us. He redeemed us. He sealed us as His very own. And so since God has been merciful to us, that's what Paul's saying there, in view of God's mercy, our priority ought to be to please Him, not to impress people. That's why in verse 2 it reminds us to no longer conform ourselves to the pattern of this world. The Phillips version paraphrases that phrase, don't let the world squeeze you into its mold. Paul says, do not conform any longer to the pattern of this world, but be transformed, he says, by the renewing of your mind, and then you'll be able to test and approve what God's will is, his good, pleasing, and perfect will. You see, folks, and we talked about this a couple of weeks ago, the world around us is obsessed with image. What will people say, we often think, or what will people think? But the Christian, Paul says here, needs to renew his or her mind. We need to change our way of thinking. What becomes more important is not what other people will think or what other people will say, but what will God think? And when we seek the praise of God more than we seek the praise of men, some people in this world are not going to understand that, folks. And they're going to try to squeeze us back into the world's mold. But that's when we have to stand our ground. And that's when we have to say with all of our hearts and be convinced in our minds that God's will and God's ways are best. So when it comes to the use of your talents, would you remember your priorities? Use your gifts. Use your abilities to please God, not to impress people. That brings us to our second point. And that is we need to realistically evaluate our gifts. Paul says in verse 3 of our text, Romans chapter 12, do not think of yourself more highly than you ought, but rather think of yourself with sober judgment in accordance with the measure of faith that God has given you. Now let's be honest, folks. There are some people who literally think more of themselves than they ought to. You know anybody like that? Don't point around, don't point out names or call out names. I've lived my whole lifetime, folks, watching athletes and rock stars and even politicians brag and boast about how important they are. Some of you are old enough to remember Muhammad Ali, the famous boxer. He used to call himself the greatest. Remember? If you didn't believe it, he would tell you he was the greatest. Gene Simmons, I grew up listening to Kiss when I was growing up as a kid, and he once said that he was God's gift to women, is what he claimed. Mike Tyson once boasted, a lot of people don't like themselves, but I happen to be totally in love with myself, is what he said. Rush Limbaugh still boasts to this day being the most listened to talk show host in the world. Ezekiel Elliott, for those of you who are football fans, says that he loves playing for the Dallas Cowboys because the Cowboys have a star on their helmet, and he said, I've always been a star. That's a Redskin fan over there, folks. That's what that is. Now, I realize that some of this hype or some of this self-promotion is just that, part of a hype to sell tickets or to get attention. But let's be honest, there are some people who generally think a lot more highly of themselves than they should. One writer said it this way, we have so emphasized a positive self-image that there are some people today who can strut sitting down. Now, the truth of the matter is, if you're one of those ones who think more highly of yourself than you should, it can actually be detrimental to your life. Because when you think that way, you're not very teachable, or you're not very ambitious. You're satisfied with where you are in life. Proverbs chapter 16, verse 18 warns us, pride goes before destruction, a haughty spirit goes before a fall. The Apostle Paul put it this way. He said, don't think of yourself more highly than you ought. Now, the problem is there are some people who go to the opposite extreme, and they think more lowly of themselves than they should. I know some wonderful Christian young women who lack confidence in themselves, and so they accept dates from men who don't even deserve to go out with them at all. I also know of good Christian wives who stay in abusive situations or relationships simply because of insecurity. They don't think of themselves to the degree that they ought to. You know of people who are in dead-end jobs, unhappy with work every day, but they just don't have enough confidence to look for something better. Do you remember in the Old Testament when God challenged Moses to go to Pharaoh and demand that people be released from slavery? And Moses felt inadequate about that, and so he said to God, oh no, God, he said, they won't believe me, I'm not a good speaker, get somebody else, God. The Bible does not say that God was pleased with Moses because of his humility. In fact, the Bible says that the wrath of God was kindled against Moses because of his lack of faith. You see, folks, an inferiority complex is not humility. I think sometimes we confuse the two. Humility is simply finding out what it is that God has gifted you to do, and then doing that with abandonment for his glory and not your own. I love the story that David Stephen tells of the Dallas Morning News. He once told the story about a football player by the name of Frank Saminsky. Frank Saminsky played for the Notre Dame football team, college football team. He was their center back in the 1940s. I don't know if we have any Notre Dame fans here or not, but Saminsky had been called in as a witness in a civil trial there in South Bend. And so the judge asked Saminsky, "Are you on the Notre Dame football team?" Saminsky responded, "Yes, Your Honor, I am." "What position do you play?" the judge asked. "Well, I play center," he said. And the judge asked him, "Are you any good?" Well, Saminsky squirmed for just a little bit and finally spoke up and said, "Your Honor, I'm the best center that Notre Dame's ever had." Well, Coach Lynn, who happened to be in the audience, was a little bit surprised by that because Saminsky had always appeared to be a rather modest and unassuming man. So when the proceedings were over, Coach Lynn took Saminsky aside and said, "Why would you say that you're the best center that Notre Dame's ever had?" And Saminsky blushingly responded, "I hated to do it, Coach, but I was unfroze." But what I'm trying to say, folks, is that in order to perform well, I understand that there has to be some degree of confidence in me. There has to be some, I believe in myself. So Laurence Olivier, the actor, was asked what it took to be a great actor, and he said, "Humility enough to prepare, and confidence enough to pull it off." Wise words. We have a responsibility as God's people not to think too highly of ourselves, but not too lowly of ourselves either. We're to think of ourselves objectively. The Bible says with sober judgment. In fact, the last part of verse 3 reads, "in accordance with the measure of faith that God's given you." Now, how are we going to do that? How are we going to know what our God-given talents or gifts are? Well, let me suggest a couple of things real quickly. Number one is you can take what they call a spiritual gifts test. I know that may sound a little worldly, but I know that there are all kinds of aptitude tests, personality tests that are available out in the world today. And if you honestly want to know what your spiritual gifts are, I have these available to you. You're more than welcome to take this home with you, fill it out in the privacy of your own home. There's even the figuring out the spiritual gifts part in the back of it. You are more than welcome to get a copy of this from me, just for your own knowledge. Okay, these are the areas where I think that God has gifted me in. You'd do well to do that. For you parents, I would challenge you. There is a wonderful book out entitled The Treasure Tree. And this book, written by John Trent and Gary Smalley, in this book, you actually, as parents, you read this book to your child. It's a very simple read. But at the end of the book, there's a series of questions that you can ask your children. And then hopefully from that, you can help him or her discover, even at a young age, what his or her spiritual gift may be. There are literally dozens of spiritual gifts, tests, or resources that are out there to help you discover what that spiritual gift or your spiritual strengths are. Now, the second way that I would challenge you to help discover that is rather simple, and that's just to try it out. And what I mean by that is simply one of the best ways to discover your giftedness is to experiment, to volunteer in an area of service and see if that's your niche. And if it is, you continue on. If not, you just say, I'm just not cut out for this, but try something else. If you recall, Jesus criticized the one talent man. Remember the story of the 1 talent, the 2 talent, the 5 talent man? He criticized the 1 talent man. Why? Because he took his 1 talent and he buried it. He didn't do anything with it. Now the 2 talent and the 5 talent man invested their life, remember? And Jesus commended them for taking that risk, for trying to do better. And I would challenge us to do that as well with our spiritual gift. You may not know this about me, and I'll just be transparent with you this morning, but I enjoy singing. I heard that. Now, for those of you who are visiting, she had a right to do that because that's my wife there that did that. But as a kid, I would often listen to the radio at night, and I would sing at the top of my lungs. And so after being in ministry for a while, I thought I had developed this talent of singing, and I was going to be able to use those talents, so I found a song that I liked. You remember that song, People Need the Lord? I know I'm dating myself when I say it. People need, no, I can't sing it for you. People need the Lord when I'm in our lives, that people need the Lord. Well, I had loved that song. I've sung it many times while I was driving in my car. And so one day I scheduled myself to sing it at the church. I think I'm a pretty good judge of character, folks. and a pretty good judge of people. So I could easily tell by looking at the faces of the people when I was singing that song that I would probably do a better job of sticking to preaching than I was to singing. But what I'm trying to say is if I hadn't taken the risk, folks, I would have never discovered my gift or my lack of it. So how are you going to know if you're gifted at teaching unless you try to teach? How are you going to know whether or not you can sing in the choir unless you try? How are you going to know whether or not you can work in the nursery or teach a children's class or work with our teenagers unless you try? How are you going to know that you have a heart for the homeless or for those in need unless you go out and try to use your gifts and abilities? How are you going to know if you have a generous heart unless you give generously? You see what I'm saying, folks? You've got to give it a try. Now, the third thing that you can do to learn your strengths is to simply ask a friend. We talk about taking a spiritual gifts test. We talk about simply trying it. Maybe turn to someone, honest friends, who will help you evaluate your strengths. Now, don't ask them questions like, well, do you think I teach well? Because that puts people on the spot. Maybe give them an option and say, well, you've heard me teach, and you've seen me work out in my yard. Which one do you think I'm better at? How do you get them to trust them? I told you about me singing at church that one time. What I didn't tell you about was what happened at the end of the service. Those of you who've ever sang in church, you know what happens when the service is over. People come on, pat you on the back, and tell you what a great song that was and what a good job you did. Well, after I had sung that song and the service was over, nobody said anything. I'm honest, folks, nobody. So I took it upon myself, and I asked one of my closest friends, who happened to be one of the elders of that church, and I asked him what he thought of my singing that morning. And he simply responded by patting me on the shoulder and saying, well, you did the best you could. Folks, if you have friends who will be that honest with you, don't get bent out of shape about that. Don't get angry with them simply because you're not gifted in that area. Just listen to their counsel. And then maybe focus on another area, like preaching instead of singing, okay, folks? That's what Paul means when he says, don't think of yourself more highly than you ought, but rather think of yourself as sober judgment in accordance with the measure of faith that God has given you. Now, there's a third principle that comes when we talk about spiritual strengths and how we're to use them, and that is that we have to refuse to compete or compare ourselves with others around us. Verse 4 of our text, and I love this part of the passage. Paul says, just as each of us has one body with many members, and these members do not all have the same function, so in Christ, Paul says, we who are many form one body, and each member belongs to the others. We all have different gifts according to the grace given us. Folks, one of the primary reasons that we feel insignificant is because we always compare ourselves to someone in that field of interest. Whether it's our intelligence, we're satisfied with the grade we got until we find out somebody's got a better grade than we did. We're satisfied with our looks until somebody walks into the room and we wonder, they look a little better than me. Sports, work, hobby. We tend to compare ourselves to those around us who have that same gift. And then we write it off by saying, well, I may not be the smartest person in the room, but I'm certainly smarter. I should have been here by our point. I'm smarter than him. I just realized that I did that wasn't going to relate well. So let me back it up. I may not be the smartest person in the room, but I'm smarter than him or her, okay? Or I may not be the best looking lady in the office, but I'm certainly prettier than she is. I know how it is. You know, it may be the same with you. People will come up to me oftentimes and ask me what I think about a certain preacher, whether it's a television preacher or a Bible speaker or somebody. And I will invariably say, oh, they're pretty good. But deep down inside, the question is, are you thinking they're better than me? Do you know what I found out? When I constantly compare myself to other preachers, I can get down on myself. When you post more on Facebook about EL sermons than you do mine, that's a hard Monday to come up against, though. Now, I know some of you said, oh, no, not you preachers. You're one of the best preachers we've ever heard. That's what you say, right? That's what you say. That's what she says. Maybe that's what everybody needs. Somebody who says, you're the best preacher I've ever heard. But we have a tendency to compare ourselves with others in our field. And all of a sudden, we don't always feel good about ourselves. We're never satisfied. We're jealous. Never quite feeling like we're as significant as maybe we hoped we were. But this passage here urges us not to fall into that trap of comparing or competing with one another. Again, the Bible says just as a body has different members with different functions, so we have different gifts, different functions within the one body. Think about how God created our bodies, folks. I love that analogy there. He knew what he was doing. He gave us 2 eyes so that we could have peripheral vision instead of just one in the center there. He gave us 2 ears so that we could hear in stereo. He gave us 2 nostrils so that when we walk into this building, you can smell that fresh coffee and know something's good waiting here. God knew what he was doing when he created this physical body. I thought about that in light of this church this past week. And it came to my recollection or to my memory there. God knew what he was doing, folks, when he created this church. This spiritual body. Think about that. 10 months ago when we formed the Compass Christian Church, God knew what he was doing. He knew that you would one day walk into this facility. And you would be looking for a place that you could call a church home. And long before we ever met you, God knew that. And so he allowed this spiritual body to be formed. He knew that you would need such a place to help you in that spiritual walk. But you know what? God also knew that this place would need you. Because you see, like members of the body, we all have different gifts. And we're to use those gifts. And when you use those gifts, then the body becomes functional. And the whole body benefits it. You know, there's been a lot of excitement over these last 10 months. For those of you who are new today, or maybe you're not aware, this church is actually the merging of 2 separate churches 10 months ago. The Liberty Christian Church and the Lynn Church of Christ. The Liberty Christian Church where I ministered, and the Lynn Church of Christ where EL ministered, merged to become one congregation. And what we thought, at least for the first few months, was let's just work on getting our 2 separate congregations together in one mind and in one spirit. Let's just kind of take it easy. Let's just get to know each other. Let's just work on blending 2 smaller congregations into one larger congregation. But God had something else in mind. And boy, what an understatement that is. God had something greater in mind. Because over the last 10 months, and for those of you who may not be aware of this, what we thought would be a slow molding of 2 congregations has become a whirlwind. What was supposed to be a congregation of 250 people has become a gathering of over 550 people, according to last week, over these last 10 months. But with that growth has come the need for more help. Whether it be in our parking lot, on our security team, whether it be a greeter at the door, someone who works in our baby nurseries or our children's classes, whether it be somebody who helps out with our teenagers, volunteers to lead a small group or teach a Sunday school class, whether it's using your musical abilities to help with our praise team, or helping with communion or taking up the offering. There is so much that needs to be done if we're going to continue to become the church that God intends for us to be. But it's going to take more than just a handful of folks who've been doing it for these past 10 months. I've said this many times over these past few months, but there is so much more that I think this church can do if only we could get every person to do his or her part. I'm going to make a rather bold statement here, and then I'm going to explain what I mean, so don't be offended. My statement is this. If you are not involved in some kind of ministry of this church, whether it's working in our Bible school, with our children, our teenagers, or any aspect of our worship service, then you are enjoying all the benefits of this church, but you are bearing none of its responsibility. MasterCard used to say with membership comes privileges. Remember that statement? Well, we ought to be saying with membership comes responsibility. Now, I realize that may be a strong statement. And I realize that may offend some of you this morning. But I've got to believe that's true. There are some of you here that had a gift that God could use to help them people to Jesus Christ, but you're failing to use that gift. And because of that, the kingdom, this church, suffers. And the most common excuse is, well, there's other people more qualified than me, they can do a better job. Well, maybe that's true, but they're not volunteering, folks. And in the meantime, this work is not getting done. And the full potential, that's what I'm talking about here. I'm happy with what God has brought us. I appreciate those of you who jumped in. But to get to our full potential, folks, we have got to all come together. and use whatever gifts, whatever abilities, whatever interest that we have so that we might win others to Jesus Christ. It's not all about just ministering to one another. It's ministering to those who are in need of being ministered to. Paul says we all have different gifts. We all have different measures of those same gifts. And so what we need to evaluate is not only where our strengths are, but a realistic assessment of that gift. The one-talent man should not be comparing himself to the five-talent man, or else he's going to feel jealous. And the five-talent person shouldn't compare himself to the one-talent person. The one who's doing five different things shouldn't be saying to himself, well, I should only have to be doing one. Some people aren't doing anything. You see what I'm saying? Then all of a sudden your spirit becomes rather condescending. The Bible says we all have different gifts, and we all have different measures of those gifts. And what we need to do is quit comparing ourselves to those around us, because we've all been created so different. Kathy Rigby, some of you will remember that years ago. Maybe you're familiar with that name. Kathy Rigby had a dream to win a gold medal in the Munich Olympics back in 1970. She was a trained gymnast, by the way, for those of you who don't know. When it came her time to perform, she was a little nervous and thought that she had done well, but she was a little devastated to find out she didn't win the gold medal. In fact, she didn't even win the silver or bronze medal. Fighting back the tears, she went up and sat with her parents. And while she was sitting there sobbing, her mother turned to her. And she said, Kathy said to her mother, she said, Mom, I did the best I could. And her mother said, Kathy, I know that. And your dad knows that. And most of all, God knows that. And then Kathy Rigby said that her mother spoke 10 words that she has never forgotten. 10 words that boosted her spirit. Her mother said, doing your best is more important than being the best. Folks, stop comparing yourself with others around you. God is evaluating you according to your abilities, to those strengths. And being the best is not as important as doing the best. And it's silly to try to get our sense of significance out of trying to beat somebody else. Because we all have different gifts, folks. We all have different measures of that same gift, which brings us to our last and final point. And that is, let's remain focused on those areas where we're gifted. The last part of verse 6 of our text says, if a man's gift is prophesying, then let him learn to serve. If a man's gift is teaching, let him be encouraging. If a woman's a good encourager, let her learn to contribute to the needs of others. Is that what it says? No, that's not what it says. What it says is, if your gift is prophesying, then what are you supposed to do? Prophesy. If a man's gift is serving, then let him serve. If it's teaching, let him teach. If it's encouraging, let him encourage. If it's contributing to the needs of others, let him give generously. If it's leadership, let him govern diligently. If it's showing mercy, let him do it cheerfully. Now, I know that sounds basic, folks, but what's amazing is how many people get off their focus. When you discover what your primary gift is, then do that to the best of your ability. Stay focused on that and that area of passion in your life, and you'll see God bring about fruit in your life. Whatever gift you're gifted to do, whatever passion it is that you have in life, you focus on that and you develop that to the best of your ability. Jim Fox said, my father always told me, find a job you love, and then you'll never have to work the rest of your life. Now that may be somewhat of an oversimplification, but that point would be well taken. You find your gift. You discover your passion in life, and you give yourself diligently and cheerfully to that. It may not be what others want you to do. It may not be what you dreamed about doing from a child, but whatever it is that God has ordained you or gifted you to do, you do to the best of your ability. Ralph Madison said it this way. We can't always be what we want to be. We can't always be anything we want to be. But we must be what God ordained us to be. Let me repeat that. We can't always be what we want to be. But we must be what God has gifted us to be. You see, folks, I think success in life, finding significance in your life, is finding what your strengths are and then giving yourself fully to that work to glorify God. I want to close with this final thought of Rick Warren, ministers at the church in Southback in California. He said to a congregation, he said, God has given me the gift to preach, not for my benefit, but for yours. And if I don't use my gift, I cheat you. And then he said, God gave you a gift, not for your benefit, but for others. And if you don't use that gift, you cheat others. You see, folks, God has given us different gifts for the building up of his body. And when we use that gift to glorify him, we begin to light those little torches along the way. Torches that show people to Jesus Christ. But when you neglect those gifts, you cheat yourself. You cheat this congregation. But most of all, you cheat God. So use whatever gifts, whatever abilities that God has given you for his glory. And then, and only then, will you begin to find significance in your life. Now, how do we close out this series? Well, first of all, if you want to find significance in your life, you need to understand that it begins with Jesus Christ. Amen? He and only he will bring significance to your life. Amen, Christians? Amen. Only he can fill that spiritual vacuum that we all have in our hearts. Amen, Christians? Amen. And so if you've never surrendered your life to him, today is the day for you to do so. In just a moment, we're going to offer an invitation. And as I say every time I preach, we call it an invitation because we're inviting you to surrender your life to the one who gave you life. And the one who will help you make sense of this life. And so if you've never surrendered yourself to Jesus Christ, we're going to give you an opportunity to do so in just a moment. Now what about those of you who are already Christians? Maybe you're looking for a church home. Maybe God brought you here today to hear this very message. And you're looking for a place where you can use your God-given abilities, those talents that God has given you to build up the body of Christ. Then this invitation time is for you as well. Because during this time, we're offering an opportunity to come forward and publicly acknowledge that you want to be a part of this church. A chance to tell this gathering of people that you want to help us bear some of the responsibility to become the church that God wants us to be. To no longer sit on the sideline or sit in the pew, but rather to volunteer your time, talents, of your treasures to help God, or help this church become the church that God intends for it to be. I can think of no greater cause for you to be a part of than to be a part of a church that wants to make a difference in the life of every person, every family that comes through these doors. So if that's something that you want to be a part of, then this invitation is for you. Gail's going to lead us in a song along with our praise team, going to lead us in an invitation hymn. I'm going to make my way down the front. And my hope is that if you're ready to give your life to Jesus, or if you're ready to pledge your membership with this congregation, you'll simply come forward, meet me down front. Share that with me. I'll share with you what you need to do or what you need to know. And together we can become the church that God wants us to be. Let's stand together. Yeah, we do.